What if you met your soulmate, but only once a year? This is the story of Anne and Jack, two people bound by fate, torn apart by choices, and reunited by love, only to face the cruel twist of destiny. Unloved due to her unattractive appearance, and lured the school hunk she'd secretly loved for 4 years back home. However, facing the prospect of her dream lover, she hesitated. By the time she'd prepared herself, he'd already put on his clothes and was about to leave. They then slept together in bed, but the man, far more reasonable than she'd imagined, simply embraced her and told her fairy tales all night. He even proposed an absurd idea. To prove their true friendship, he proposed a meeting every July 15th. Determined to remain with this playboy, and reluctantly agreed, believing in the inevitability of love. In a flash, July 15th, 1989 arrived, and as promised, they met in London. That year, the naive and harbored a burning dream of becoming a writer, while Jack, a typical playboy, headed straight for Paris, pursuing a life of unfettered freedom. Their divergent paths foreshadowed their impending separation. Before leaving, Jack told Annie that reality was always different than she hoped. Because her writing career hadn't brought her any income, Annie had to settle for a job in a restaurant, where she was stuck in the dreary, monotonous routine day after day. Her once passionate dreams were slowly being worn away by the repetitive grind of daily life. In these moments, she instinctively picked up the phone, called Jack, and confided her inner distress and confusion. However, Jack, immersed in his romantic pursuits, often perfunctorily handled his affairs, completely disregarding Annie's feelings. Jack's life stood in stark contrast to Annie's. His handsome appearance brought him success, with women constantly approaching him. Not only had he obtained training as a television host, he had a promising career ahead of him, and his parents' doting, carefree life was filled with comfort and ease. This, in turn, fostered his unruly personality. Even during their meeting, he showed no regard for Annie's feelings, kissing another woman right in front of her, and forced a smile, trying to mask her disappointment with the news of her promotion to manager. But Jack saw these as mere trifles. He believed Anne was simply wasting her youth. She simply lacked confidence in her own life, so he suggested they go on vacation together the next time they met. Although they waited another year, they finally left in 1992. Before leaving, Anne laid down 3 rules: no flirting, separate sleeping rooms, and no nudity in front of each other. He thought this would preserve the purity of their friendship, but in reality, these were what he most wanted. He had been in love with Jack since graduation day. That night, they nearly crossed the line, but at the last minute, and backed off. Jack seemed too perfect to her, and the fear of being with him was even greater than the joy of her secret crush. He also knew Jack was a playboy, and it seemed that only by maintaining distance could the relationship remain viable. This twisted mentality made the two of them so-called friends. Jack knew he'd never lacked women, but Anne's intelligence and passion for life forced him to suppress his desires, while also not wanting to lose this confidant. So, the two of them teetered on the brink of romance, neither willing to let go, neither afraid to cross the line. Perhaps it was the alluring atmosphere of that night at the bar, or perhaps Anne's feelings could no longer be concealed. In that moment, he confessed his years-long obsession with Jack, confessing countless love poems and story drafts centered around him. But Jack simply smiled faintly and then dragged Anne to the pool, breaking the 3rd rule they'd agreed upon. But even as Anne was overcome with emotion, this seemingly playful remark completely touched her softest spot. She pushed Jack underwater, trying to hide the tears threatening to fall. That night, they shared the same bed as usual. All those established rules, broken on the very first day. Fast forward to 1993. Jack, now the most popular TV host in the country, gradually lost himself in his drunken life. For the first time, he broke his 4-year promise to Annie. Even after hurriedly calling to apologize, Annie could smell the strong scent of alcohol through the phone. She was more worried than angry. "Promise me, I'll come home." I will. Even in a forgotten corner, Annie kept her eye on Jack. Jack, barely 30, had overdrawn his body from his long years of debauchery, but he seemed unfazed, continuing his own way. He easily forgot the promise they'd made in 5 years, confident that Annie would always be there, waiting for his return. However, Annie's heart had already changed. She was tired of this passive waiting, tired of feeling ignored. The once passionate love between them was quietly fading. When Jack called again to apologize, Annie, despite clearly hearing him, feigned ignorance, closing the door and leaving indifferently. He had an important date that night with an unknown comedian. This man wasn't particularly impressive, even a bit stingy. But unlike Jack, he was devoted to Annie, a tenderness that Jack had never been able to offer. It was in this drenched scene that the two quietly began a romantic relationship, as if fate had finally favored Annie. However, people often learn to cherish only after they've lost something. Fast forward to July 15th of the 6th year, and Jack took the initiative to ask Annie out, only to be politely declined. Annie, once down and out, had now, through her own hard work, become a middle school teacher. Due to student performances, she had no time for a date, but she agreed to meet again on July 15th of the following year. Time flew by, and the promised date quietly arrived. Annie stood at a crossroads, hesitating whether to meet Jack, as her boyfriend had always known about their meeting. As Annie secretly watched Jack's show in front of a TV, her boyfriend treated her with the utmost respect and tolerance. Respecting his feelings, Annie proactively asked him what he thought and sincerely told him that if he minded, she could skip the date. Surprisingly, he placed his complete trust in her, believing she knew her limits. When Annie and Jack met again, Jack's condition left her even more disappointed. He spoke incoherently, like a drug addict in trouble, frequently returning to the bathroom. It was as if he harbored some unspeakable secret. Even more chilling was his unbridled audacity to flirt with other women in front of her. The man who had once driven her crazy was now a complete stranger. When the conversation turned to Annie's teaching career, he regarded her with a gaze bordering on mockery. In that moment, Annie's defenses completely crumbled. Years of love and anticipation transformed into disappointment. This sudden argument instantly destroyed the last remaining connection between them. Jack, realizing his own gaffe, rushed after her, attempting to salvage the shattered situation. However, it seemed beyond redemption, and knew full well that in Jack's world, he had become insignificant. The moment and resolutely fled, Jack's heart plummeted. The agony of his idle chasing overwhelmed him. 3 years, like an invisible chasm, separated them completely. Like two parallel lines, they briefly intersected, each pursuing a completely different destinies. In the days that followed, and remained radiant and maintained her former zest for life, Jack, once a prominent figure, had become a marginalized figure. His once popular show had now become a forgotten corner. Forced by life's pressures, he was forced to become a live-in son-in-law, completely abandoning his dreams and dignity. Time passed, and Jack's former pride and unbridled spirit were worn down by life. He treaded on thin ice in his new family, carefully maintaining a semblance of composure. Meanwhile, and returned to writing, seeking answers within her writing. However, when her boyfriend stumbled upon a love letter and had written to Jack, a heated argument erupted between them. After calming down, and came to clearly see the true nature of marriage, a loveless marriage is nothing but constant torture. She decisively chose to part ways peacefully. Suddenly, on July 15, 2000, their 11th anniversary, they met again at a college classmate's wedding. Jack was already married, while Anne, though still single, was increasingly radiant. She instantly captured Jack's attention, and an unspeakable sadness welled up within her. When they finally had a chance to reminisce, they perfectly concealed their true feelings, as if returning to their first date. Behind those seemingly casual words lay unspoken longing and regret. Their eyes occasionally met, but they quickly averted their gazes, fearing the other would peek into their most vulnerable corners. However, when a wedding invitation arrived, she was slightly startled. She quickly composed herself, forced a smile, and embraced Jack. Seeing the once playboy transform into a responsible father, she was genuinely happy for him, but a wave of loss washed over him. She had imagined countless times that they would walk through every stage of life together, but now those beautiful fantasies had become empty illusions. They had promised each other that no matter what, they would never disappear from each other's worlds, but Anne knew that the only tenderness she could offer Jack was to remain silent. A year later, Jack became a father, and time had quietly worn away his brilliance. The once incompetent young man had transformed into a calm and reserved man. Life's trivialities and pressures, far from holding him back, only strengthened his resolve to shoulder the burden of family. However, his wife's betrayal was like a hammer, ruthlessly shattering Jack's short-lived marriage. After completing his divorce, filled with both anticipation and trepidation, he boarded a train to Paris alone, hoping to find his former lover. When he finally reunited with, and he was struck by the sight. And had transformed into a courageous writer, her short hair radiating a refined and effortless beauty, a more mature and independent person. Meanwhile, Jack, devastated by a failed marriage, saw the new, and a surge of mixed emotions. He was heartened by her excellence, yet lost in the feeling of loss, a seemingly unbridgeable chasm between them. Jack wanted to confess his feelings to Anne, but Anne told him she was in love, leaving him with an indescribable bitterness. He could only leave quietly, but before parting, he couldn't resist taking one last look at Anne. Seeing Anne so affectionately with her boyfriend, he suddenly realized how heartbroken he must have been when and once endured the same pain. He regretted not cherishing Annie and blamed himself for putting her through so much hardship. But Jack knew nothing could be undone. He could only silently wish Annie his best and let her pursue her own happiness. However, just as Jack, disheartened and ready to leave, Annie made an unexpected choice. He knew that if they missed this opportunity again, they would likely regret it forever. "Are you willing?" "I was." With Jack's promise, a love that had been delayed for 15 years finally blossomed in the cracks of time. They chose July 15th as their wedding date, bearing witness to the passage of time. Their married life was as idyllic as a fairy tale, each day filled with warmth and anticipation. Jack invested everything he had in opening a small coffee shop in a corner of the city, quietly working towards their future. Everything seemed perfect, as if fate had finally opened its arms to them. However, a cruel accident, as always, strikes at the most beautiful moments. That day, Annie deliberately took a shortcut on her bike to see Jack sooner, but she never expected that in that ordinary moment, a car accident would strike suddenly and violently. As the mudslide struck, Anne's consciousness raced through the most precious memories of her life. The heartbeat of her first encounter with Jack, the moments they'd shared together, those moments gilded by tenderness, all became remarkably clear. She longed to see Jack one last time, to confess her love with her final strength. Sadly, Anne's final breath had slipped away, leaving her life frozen in time on this sunny afternoon, filled with endless regret and longing. This love affair, spanning 18 years, came to a heartbreaking end. Anne's passing toward Jack in two, as if he had lost his soul, sinking once again into an abyss of numbness and despair. He often mistook strangers for and on the street, his inner trauma so deep that it blurred the lines between reality and memory. Anne's tenderness in her life seemed to have left an indelible mark on him. With his soul lost, he became a troublemaker, even suffering a beating that left him bloodied. Finally, unable to bear his fall, the elder sister returned him to his elderly father. This was Jack's first time back home since his mother's death. His elderly father, in a calm and earnest voice, admonished him to live as if Annie were still by his side, saying only then would he live up to his spirit. At that moment, Jack suddenly realized he had endured a decade of silent loneliness and longing. Seeing his father's aging face, he felt a surge of guilt, yet also a renewed hope to live. Resolving not to dwell on the sadness and decadence of the past, Jack channeled his longing for Annie into motivation and resumed his cafe. On the surface, Jack had adjusted to life without Annie. The cafe still closed, and his pace appeared calm. However, deep down, Annie's memory never left him, and his thoughts kept drifting back to the day they met 20 years ago. What if they had decided to be together then? He would have taken Annie to the summit, overlooking the magnificent scenery amidst the surrounding mountains, feeling the cool mountain breeze, and making an eternal vow that transcended time and space. They would walk hand in hand through every stage of life, composing a magnificent song of life together. He would joyfully introduce Anne to his parents, imagining the happy smile on her face. What a touching moment that would be. The story seemed to have ended, but in Jack's heart, it was only the beginning. This unforgettable love would forever flow deep in his heart, like an endless poem. And that's the unforgettable story of Anne and Jack, proof that love can survive time, distance, and heartbreak. But fate always has the final say. If you enjoyed this movie breakdown, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the story.